Welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to our Curious Amalgam. I'm Alicia Downey, and the title of today's episode is Ready Player One? Antitrust Issues and Online Gaming. When you hear online gaming, your first thought is about antitrust, right? Maybe not, but if you've ever played an arcade game, used a video game console in your house, downloaded a gaming app, or put your headset on and sat in front of your computer, gaming all night, you've tuned into the right episode of our Curious Amalgam. On today's episode, we're going to walk through the evolution of online gaming. When we're on that journey, we'll also talk about antitrust, consumer protection, and privacy issues playing out in this important marketplace. I'm here today with my co-host, Anant Raut. Hey, Anant.
Alicia, are you a gamer?
Sometimes.
I think my heyday would have been Rampage, Spy Hunter, maybe even as far as Street Fighter 2, which for cultural reasons I would always play Dalsim. But luckily, our guest today is a true expert, not just on that era, but the modern era of online gaming and multiplayer games. Josh Grant. He has more than 20 years of experience leading and advising gaming and media companies and is a consultant with Wit Legal, a leading expert witness agency. Josh has led more than 25 games and apps to market across a variety of entertainment platforms. So thanks for being here today with us, Josh.
Thank you, Anant, and nice to meet you, Alicia.
All right. So, Josh, gaming probably means different things to different people. Can you just define for us what we're going to be talking about today when we talk about gaming?
Certainly. As you indicated, so it sounds like you and I started playing games around the same era, and most people think about, when they think about gaming, to that time period in the early, mid-'80s in terms of arcade games and then the first home dedicated consoles. Fortunately, the market, as technology has changed and shifted and adapted, the market has grown and changed as well, which I think is a good thing because it has brought a wave of adoption by almost every demographic group and type and region around the world. And I believe that games can bring people together perhaps more than religion or politics or even sports today. So generally today, to come up with something that is more inclusive, we usually mean some form of digital interactive content played for entertainment purposes on a device. And that device can either be a dedicated platform like the Sony PlayStation or Microsoft's Xbox, or it can be a multi-purpose device like a personal computer or a smartphone.
And just to clarify for our listeners, we're not talking about gambling. We're talking about kind of video gaming in its current form.
That's absolutely correct. There are some overlaps, and as we'll talk later when we get into some of the antitrust and consumer protection concepts that I think are important today, there are some overlap in terms of game mechanics, but generally this side of video gaming or digital gaming or interactive or online gaming, it typically stops at the line where consumers are not repatriating funds back into an account that can be spent outside the game. So there might be games of chance that you see in both our gaming as well as gambling. There might be game mechanics that are used in both. There might be games of skill that are used in both. But I think a pretty clear demarcation is to set the line at, can funds of value be repatriated to the consumer and used outside of the gaming environment?
And we will get to an interesting intersection later when we talk about loot boxes. But for now, let's go back and talk about this evolution of video gaming. The games that I started this podcast off with, I think a lot of people who are listening to this, they grew up with the arcade era or Metroid. You buy a cartridge, you plug it into a console, you own that cartridge, you play it as much as you want. How has video gaming evolved in the intervening decades?
Certainly. And just to give you just some broad brushstrokes of what the market looks like today, as you talk about that evolution, currently the market is around $250 billion. The total market size around the time of those first consoles and arcade stand-up games was probably around 20 to 25 billion, pretty much a 10x increase over that time period. And about 50% of the population in the United States, for example, plays games on some kind of platform weekly. And it's interesting from a business model perspective, mobile is now the single largest platform in terms of revenue in gaming, and the single largest monetization hook or technique or segment is in-game advertising. And this reflects a few of the trends that have shaped the gaming landscape over the past 20 years.
Just to jump in on that quickly, Josh, I think what catches a lot of people off guard once you start to tell them about the size of this market is just how much bigger online gaming, esports is relative to other North American sports. I don't think people realize how many people worldwide play these games and how large this market is.
Absolutely. And that's a function of some big advances in technology in terms of computing power, online storage, internet activity or connectivity, drastically reducing cost to store and cost to ship data back and forth in terms of cost per bandwidth or cost per CPU, as well as the evolution of kind of non-dedicated devices. If we go back, we think about the arcade model, it was a pay per play. You would go somewhere to play games specifically. You would drop a quarter in a machine and you would play until you lost your 3 lives. So the next segment was the first generation of dedicated consoles. Most people think about the first Nintendo console, Sega Genesis. There were a handful at the time. And if you fast forward today, really been just the market looks completely different. You can play a game anywhere, anytime. You can play it in a complete single player standpoint. You can play in real time against other people. You can play in real time against characters created by the computer system, by the game program. And then you can also play turn-based games. Words with Friends had a massive impact in bringing multiplayer gaming to vastly larger and more expansive audiences than ever before. In addition, we're seeing more and more different types of business models and monetization mechanisms, which I know we'll get into in a little bit, reducing the cost and removing the constraint of a dedicated platform, and also the creativity of artists and developers in bringing new types of game genres to the market has had a result in this tremendous growth and explosion of video games over the past 20 years.
And this, Alicia, to me is fascinating because you see a lot of, it's not just video gaming, but a lot of industries are moving from one-time sales to how do you get smooth, consistent revenues. I think this aspect of the market is very interesting.
Right. Let's talk about the business models. Certainly, I'm familiar enough with some games that are free because I can't avoid them every time I open up my smartphone. But what are the other ways that the companies are generating revenue?
Absolutely. We went from a concept of games as a discrete product, which would be purchased in retail at a fixed price, $25 for a game cartridge. Currently, the games that still exist in that model, the price is around $75 or $80. So we've gone from purchasing a piece of content that had a start and an end that could be played for an approximate average number of hours, and that would be owned by the consumer, and would either be a single player experience or something that would be played in a party game format with friends or family, but in the same room on the same device. We've evolved from that to games that can be played anywhere, anytime, from different devices or across different devices. So a player can play a game on their Sony PlayStation or Microsoft Xbox, and they can also be playing the same game in real time against other players who are playing on a PC, or one mobile device to a PC or mobile to mobile. And so this has really shifted a number of core elements of developing and running merchandising, publishing, distributing games. And one of it is that games are now a service. So it's no longer something that you own that has a static or fixed amount of content. It's a service that the consumer continues to check in with and receive new content from. And so this means that there need to be employees and money spent at the developer and the publisher to continue to make new content. As games started to shift into this game or content as a service model, and developers and publishers had to hire additional employees, invest in additional technology, they started to incur additional costs, and there needed to be a change in the way that games were priced in order to allow the companies that were supplying this content to pay for the technology and the talent that continued to develop it. So this ushered in this era of either subscription games. So you subscribe to a game like World of Warcraft and you pay $19.99 a month and you connect to the internet. The game updates and you seamlessly on the fly get access to that new content as part of your subscription. And this was working pretty well and pretty consistently across both the PC and the console markets. And then mobile on smartphone really took off in some very surprising ways. Initially, many of the games were deemed very light. They were Bejeweled Blitz or other match 3 puzzle games that were either played in a single player format or multiplayer, but in turn-based. And these games were largely free to play and were supported with advertising. Eventually, freemium models started to come into play as the technology for mobile phone gaming started to allow more and more robust 3D games that would look and feel and play basically at the same level of quality that you might see on a dedicated device or platform game. So this then ushered in the era of the start of freemium games where the game would be free to download and you might be able to play for a certain period of time, but then at some point the player would hit roadblocks, and then to overcome them, you would either need to grind in the game, so play the game relentlessly for hours and hours to build up enough stamina or enough points or enough in-game currency to progress, or you would invest real-world dollars in exchange for digital currency, and then you could continue to progress through the game, or watch advertisements in order to progress through the game. As many of the large console companies started to acquire large mobile developers and publishers, we've now arrived at this hybrid model where there's a cost to download the title, and then there is either a subscription fee or players have the opportunity to spend real-world money in the game on what are called buffs or power-ups to augment their character, to make the character more competitive or more appealing or to progress faster through the game. So we've seen 3 distinct generations of pricing and business models that have all now essentially rolled into this freemium plus model that we're seeing across consoles, PC, and mobile.
Thinking about the market dynamics that you've talked about, what are some of the recent antitrust issues involving the industry? How do the market dynamics play into them?
Yeah, so I'd say over the past 10 years as the backdrop to the 3 epochs that I just described, we've seen antitrust litigation largely in 3 buckets. The first is the walled garden bucket, which is that consumers that own a gaming device, whether that's a smartphone or a console, are only able to purchase and download content to be played on that device from the platform owner and distribution company, and that there is a fee that the developer or publisher pays in order to merchandise and sell games or offer games as a service to consumers on that platform. And that fee has been pegged around 30% for a number of years. So the second revolves around anti-competitive market consolidation. And this is probably the most famous example in the last couple of years has been Microsoft's Activision Blizzard deal, which has now been approved in the UK. Still has some issues with the FTC, but the deal is closed now in the United States. And the third is this area around deceptive marketing, game addiction, and loot boxes. And there's been a series of lawsuits, both in the United States, the UK, and in Europe around deceptive marketing and these loot box gotcha game mechanics. And all 3 of these, I think, are a result, or in part a result, of the market dynamics that have helped drive the explosive growth that we've seen. You know, we've seen tremendous consolidation and vertical integration in the market over the last 10 years. Consolidation in the form of developers acquiring other developers or publishers acquiring successful developers so that they can own that content and then turn that content into an annual franchise where they take a hit game and they release a new update every year, you know, much like in the 80s, you saw a series of action movies where, you know, it was this movie 1, this movie 2, this movie 6, this movie 7. And then on the vertical integration, owning as much of the supply chain as you can. So platform distribution companies over the last handful of years have increasingly been acquiring the developers of content, the publishers of that content, as well as various forms of distribution and the technology that supports hosting and running these digitally distributed and played games.
Josh, what is the incentive for them to own rather than just the old model of just license from these developers?
I think there's a few answers to that. One is licensing typically works very well in the game industry for IP that has already been established on another platform. So licensing typically works very well when you have a popular brand or franchise that has been in the entertainment space as a movie, a television show, a game on another format. So you see board games licensed and brought in to have digital versions created. You see a very popular tentpole franchises from the Paramounts of the world, the Disneys of the world, get licensed to make video games. But licensing video game content that has not been proven is a pretty significant risk. So typically what will happen is the publisher will enter into an agreement with the developer and they will get the exclusive rights to publish the content. And then if things work well, typically they'll come back and acquire the developer outright because they want to have access to that talent to be able to continue to make updates in future releases. Where if they licensed one copy or one version only, they could potentially become a victim of their own success. Also, in terms of the market dynamics, direct user acquisition has been increasingly prevalent and pervasive. Video games, typically, publishers and distribution companies do not spend money advertising on television, although every once in a while you will see Super Bowl ads. But the best way to acquire gamers on these platforms is to market to other gamers that are already on the platform. And so if you have control of the platform, or if you have control of a vast library of content, you have access to a vast network of gamers, it drives down your user acquisition costs.
Josh, it's not just antitrust issues that we're seeing in the gaming industry, but also we're starting to see consumer protection issues. When I was on Capitol Hill, there was a lot of interest and concern over loot boxes. Can you tell us what are loot boxes and why are they so controversial?
A loot box is an in-game device, usually in the form of a visual object of value. So it could be, if you're playing a pirate game theme, it might literally be a treasure chest. So it's an in-game device in the form of something of value. And players spend either real-world dollars or real-world dollars that have been converted into in-game currency at a fixed amount for a random reward. It is a game of chance where the user has a fixed cost and there's an expectation of return, but the expectation of return is not transparent to the player. So the player doesn't know what the odds are.
And I think this is the concern from a lot of policymakers, is that it just looked like you are marketing gambling. It is basically gambling. You are putting money in. You don't know what virtual object you're getting back, and you're marketing gambling to children.
Yes, and obviously, while many adults like myself play games, and hopefully we are mature enough and wise enough to be able to make prudent financial decisions with the dollars that we have allocated to our entertainment, many of these games are played and still played, increasingly played by children, and those children may not have the same education, they may not have the same awareness, they may not have the same recognition or real understanding around what the actual cost is in real dollars. Because similar to how casino companies, if you go to a casino, you don't typically take your cash and put it on the blackjack table. You typically must exchange that cash for casino chips that are provided by the casino company, and then you're gambling by proxy, right? You're gambling with that fiat chip currency. And obviously there's a lot of reasons why casino companies might do it that way, but it's basically the same in video games. So a child or their parent might have access to a digital wallet. They might put $20 or $50 or $100 into their player account. They might take some of that money, convert it into digital currency. They're playing a competitive multiplayer game. They continue to lose. They go to the store. They see this shiny object with lights and colors and flashing, say, click here for a reward. So they click and they're sinking the virtual currency into this loot box or gotcha mechanic. Eventually, they're going to dry up their in-game currency funds. And now what happens, right? Now the concern is that now they go back to that wallet and they're sinking more and more real money into the fiat currency, which is then being gambled or invested, depending on your perspective.
Josh, there's been another competition issue that has come up in online gaming, and that has to do with the in-app payment processing charges that app stores like Apple's and Google's charge to third-party developers. Can you explain this issue to our listeners?
Let's take mobile, for example. So in many markets, including the United States, for mobile content applications, including games, there are two major providers of online digital stores. One is Apple with its App Store, and the other is Google with the Android Play Store. And for Apple, for example, if you're a consumer and you want to download any form of app content, whether it's a utility app or a game, you need to go through the App Store. In order for a developer or publisher to put content on the App Store, it has to go through a variety of security protocols, a variety of reviews for content, making sure that it's safe content, that it's not spam, that it's not spyware, etc. And then that content gets approved. The files actually get hosted by Apple, and then images of that content, that app, that game, whatever it is, are then merchandised according to various formulas known and controlled by Apple and Google, gets merchandised in the digital store on the phone. Then users, they download that and they pay for it with an account that is between the user, the consumer, and Apple, or between the consumer and Google. When that transaction happens, the platform distribution company, Apple or Google, they receive the retail cost that the consumer pays, and then they withhold a fee and they remit the remainder back to the developer. There's some subtleties on the back end about returns and things like that, but I think we can ignore the minutia for right now.
Yeah, and just to really crystallize it for our users. So, for example, if you had the Spotify app on through your iPhone or through your Android, and then you wanted to renew like an annual subscription plan, I think the way it worked is that you pay $1, Spotify gets 70 cents, and 30 cents goes to the App Store. Similarly, if you have a game and the game is free, but you want to buy a new skin or something like that, you pay $1, 70 cents or less goes to the developer, 30 cents goes to the App Store. And I think we were seeing the third-party developers really express frustration not only over having to pay this amount, but being forbidden under the terms and conditions from asking users to just go to the website or somewhere outside of the app so that they get more revenue.
Absolutely. And that's really there are two issues, right? One is, and this is a matter that has been brought before the courts in Epic and Apple, and now Epic and Google, as well as a number of other cases over the years. But the issue is really twofold from the developer or publisher's perspective. The first is the percentage fee itself. So when you're downloading an application for a game and it costs $1, it's that 30% fee. So if you were to compare that 30% fee to the payment processing fee charged in other environments, it's quite a bit higher. The platform companies maintain that 30% fee is not just for payment processing, that there's a number of other benefits they provide. I'm going to stay out of my opinions on those matters. But that 30% fee is larger than any other market. And then the other issue is if I'm on Apple, I can't go to any other provider. So the only content that I can acquire is merchandised and hosted and controlled by Apple. And the fee is collected by Apple and the remainder is remitted back to the developer or publisher. But there's no other channel to market for the device. So it would be, for example, somewhat similar to so I have a Toyota truck. So I go to, a Toyota dealership and I buy the truck. But now whenever I want to put gas in it, I have to go to a Toyota gas station, right? So those are really the two issues with this kind of walled garden exclusivity concept in the 30%.
And as you mentioned, the response that we're seeing to that is Epic basically invited a lawsuit from Apple by deliberately violating those terms and conditions to see what would happen. They've also now, that case went to trial. We're seeing them in trial with Google. We've also seen legislative activity in the Netherlands, in Korea, legislation requiring these platforms to provide alternative payment services, options for the third-party developers. We saw legislation like that in the U.S. as well that didn't go anywhere, but I think it was the App Store bill that would have done the same thing in the U.S.
You've seen this in the Netherlands and other areas in Europe where I think there's just a different legislative posture with respect to where these bodies come down between sort of consumer protection versus competition. And I think typically in the U.S., things fall more on relying on market dynamics or competition as opposed to the sort of solution through legislation for consumer protection. But that might change. What was interesting is that even though Epic did not prevail in its case against Apple, which really was a contractual matter, right? Because Epic did some things that were specifically prohibited in the developer agreement with Apple. Apple gave them the opportunity to resubmit their builds. They refused. Apple kicked them out, but it was really over the contractual issue itself. But there were a number of other companies that came to publicly support Epic, publicly support Epic, all the way from other competitors in the game space to newspaper companies and other companies as well. So perhaps a groundswell will emerge or evolve at some point. The other thing that has really been interesting in the Google matter is that game publishers and developers, like people like myself, when we have worked with Apple and Google, we would all gripe about the fee, of course, but the one thing that we would always say is we're all paying it. It turns out that's not true. So there are a number of companies that are partners with these platform companies that were paying a lower fee than the fee that we were all told everyone was paying. That really has been emerging in the Google Epic matter. So it will be interesting to see how that's resolved and if perhaps that information coming to light changes the legislative response.
In an industry where hundreds of billions of dollars are at stake, I'm sure there's going to be a lot more interesting developments come up. For this very interesting conversation, thank you, Josh, for being a wonderful guest. But before we let you go, we want to ask you the questions we ask every guest to get to know them a little bit better as a person. And the first thing we want to ask you is to tell us something interesting about yourself that is outside of your professional life.
One of the big focal areas of my life, passion has always been martial arts, and I'm a martial arts and self-defense instructor outside my professional life.
Oh, what type?
So we train Krav Maga, Muay Thai, Jiu-Jitsu, and we roll it all together into combative mixed martial arts.
That's wonderful. That's really cool. I'd love to get into it, but I think I'm too old.
No one's ever too old. We had a beautiful couple come in this morning, and the gentleman was 84 and the woman was 79. So never too old to train.
All right. The last thing we're going to do as we end the show is to play a little game we call The Curious Hat.
And now it's time for The Curious Hat.
The rules of the game could not be more simple. I'm going to draw a surprise random question from a virtual hat. And here we go. Are you ready, Josh?
Yes.
We know you like martial arts, but do you like to dance? And if you do, how would you describe your dance style?
I have 3 daughters, and they are big in the performing arts. And so when we cook dinner, we put on music, and they love Taylor Swift. So there's some pop and hip hop dancing while we cook dinner, probably 3 or 4 nights a week.
So you're like a freestyle guy then? Is that it?
Yes.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you again. This has been a very interesting discussion. Thank you to Anant for an excellent job.
Yeah, this was fun.
And thank you to listeners for listening, and I hope you'll tune in to the next Our Curious Amalgam episode.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust section has to offer at ambar.org/antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.